Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lecture with the title Telescopic Urbanism. And the lecture is being organized by the Department of Human Geography here at Stockholm University, together with the Royal Institute of Arts, Mejan Ark. And we are very pleased to have today with us Professor Amin, who has traveled from the UK to be with us and deliver this lecture. Amin is Professor of Geography at Cambridge University, and he has published widely and has contributed to a broad range of important academic debates, and I will not even dare to list them all, only to mention a few, and those that stand closest to our own research interests at this department. He has been quite tone-setting in connection to urban studies. And given that the Department of Human Geography also has a long tradition in urban studies and urban planning, this is a particularly fortunate occasion for us to inspire us and to challenge us in our thinking. And you've already been an important source of inspiration for several of us at the department with your broad work on urban issues. And among other things, Amin has written a lot about urban diversity and urban cohesion, particularly aspects of multiculturalism and racial integration. He has also of late been reflecting upon issues relating to urban environments, urban ecologies, urban resilience. And he's generally been challenging us to think the city anew, and he has contributed in important ways to our problematization of the urban more generally, thinking of cities as relational entities, as embedded in wider flows and networks. He is also an important source of inspiration in the sense that he encourages us to imagine the urban future in new paths, in new ways. And today he's going to share some of his ideas in this regard. And particularly important is when we try to think into the future and to challenge certain urban imaginaries that are gaining a lot of attention and force, both in academia and more generally. And today, Amin is going to talk about particularly on the problems of certain important urban imaginaries that exist today that tend to value and make visible certain parts of the city and render invisible, marginalize, or fail to account for other parts of the city or other groups of urban citizens. And this is in a nutshell what you call this telescopic urbanism that Ash is going to develop for us. So we really look very much forward to listen to your talk on these issues. I'd like to mention that Professor Amin is a very prolific writer, although he claims he's not, but he really is. He has authored or co-authored and edited and co-edited 17 books and written over 100 journal articles and book chapters. So that's a really impressive record. And just to mention a few of his important books that he has authored or co-authored with others or edited or co-edited, among others the rather known book Cities Reimagining the Urban from 2002. He is also the author of Land of Strangers, which was a more recent book from 2012, and his most recent book called Arts of the Political, which is just out of the oven. And there are some prospects here that you're welcome to grab on your way out. On top of this, Professor Amin is also founding co-editor of the Review of International Political Economy, is an associate editor of the journal titled City, and is on the advisory board of a number of international journals. He has also been awarded the Royal Geographical Society's Edward Heath Prize in 1998 for his contributions to research on Europe. And finally, he's also an important advisor to international organizations such as the OECD and the European Commission. So without going on so much further, which I really could, I will draw the line here and leave the floor to you. So most welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for your very kind words of welcome. This is such a beautiful city to come to, so it's my pleasure to be here. And I want to begin with an example or an anecdote which is really relevant for this occasion. Exactly 2 years ago, I was invited to a seminar which was hosted by your king on future, it was called the Future Urban World. And over 2.5 days in Gripsholm Castle, beautiful castle, about 20 of us, urban scholars, business leaders, politicians, opinion makers, some people from the media, and quite a few high-ranking people from kind of the development world, World Bank, or even some significant NGOs. We talked about ensuring how the urban world could reinforce a synergy between, and these were words that were chosen by your king, between growth, equity, and sustainability. So, all of them. And then, along with a Swede who had a very high-level experience in UN Habitat in Nairobi, I was given my moment in the sun. So the two of us had 15 minutes to make our case. And I was asked to introduce the topic of the unborn city, excuse me, the unbuilt city for the unborn 3 billion people. So what I said in my presentation was that this city has already been built, okay, the city of the future, that it exists in the megacities of the world, and it's called slum or squatter city. And I also argued that this city, which will house something like 1/3 of the world's population by 2050, and now survives in extraordinarily harsh environments, will require much more than development from below to secure a semi-decent existence for these 3 billion people, 1/3 of the world's population by 2050. And I also proposed that if that was the case, that the scale of the issue is so problematic, that what we require, once again, in the way that we've kind of forgotten since the post-war period, is to think about, and I use these exact words, the large-scale engineering of well-being. And that this could be achieved through such things like housing tenure reform, better public services, sustained anti-poverty commitment. And I thought I was doing quite well in this audience. I thought I was on quite receptive ground because we were in Sweden. But my talk was not well received at all. I mean, all the guns came out. And I was told that I was too pessimistic. I was told by the guy from the head of the World Bank in Northern Africa that the real issue was inequality and not poverty. And I was told that slum life was much more dynamic than I had portrayed it in my 5 minutes, and that the long haul of shifting thinking on development away from a discourse of rights towards a discourse of if you like, local empowerment and bottom-up responsibility was the only way forward, and that the kind of thinking that I was proposing was a heroic, unnecessary step back into the past. So, I left the workshop a bit bemused, a little bit depressed as well, and I felt my age. I felt distinctly out of date. Okay? And then I thought about this problem, and this unease that I had couldn't be explained away because of the social composition of the group. Okay, this was the kind of developmentalista elite presided over by your kind of nice king. And I then wrote this paper. And this paper is essentially an attempt to make sense of this slightly laid-back attitude towards poverty in the developing world, in the cities of the developing world. And the claim that I want to make is that this, what I call a parsimonious attitude towards the great issues of our times, comes from an understanding of the future as parsimonious, that hasn't a lot to offer, that it's a very uncertain future, so it's changing all the time. And it's a future in which, if you want to get somewhere, you have to be opportunistic. You have to grab the moment. And this projection of the future, as I've described it, comes with a particular, almost mainstream understanding of what the city is today. That the city is just a collection of settlements. It doesn't exist as a single entity anymore. Or indeed, the city is no more, or not any longer, the sum of its parts. And as a result, in this imaginary of the city as a place of many things and many spaces, particular and only particular parts of the city are then projected as spaces of potentiality or spaces of hope. And as a consequence, the obligation to think of the city as a whole, as a commons, or a set of mutual obligations between different parts and different social classes of the city is kind of recedes into the background. And this thinking, I think, is reaffirmed, is confirmed by two very powerful imaginaries of urban life, which have risen very much into the foreground in the last few years. One comes from a colonizing minority with very powerful global allies, and another one comes from, regrettably, I think unwittingly, comes from advocates of a contained majority, the poor. And what's really ironical for me, and I'm sure you will tell me in the discussion I'm completely wrong, that both of these imaginaries trace very, very similar subjectivities of survival in the future. And that's the thesis that I want to offer this afternoon. So let's turn to one of these, the elite imaginary of the possible city of the future. And I want to start with the role that we in geography ourselves have played in constructing this imaginary of the future. In the last few decades, a lot of economic geographers and practitioners who are sensitive to the territorial dynamics of capitalism have actually worked very hard to propose cities as the engines of the knowledge economy. And the account that is offered of the new urban economic order is a very familiar one. It finds vitality in particular parts of the city in a certain abundance of supply side readiness, knowledge, skills, skilled workers, entrepreneurial dynamism. The cities are places of entrepreneurial dynamism, of the clustering of knowledge. Clever people come and cluster in cities. And that the modern metropolis, or certain parts of the modern metropolis, is the place where elites hang out. So this combination of supply-side agglomeration, plus sociality, plus elites, plus the knowledge economy, makes cities into engines of future growth. And more or less everybody has come to accept this now. That the continuation of our capitalist future rather depends on the success of some cities and some parts of cities to act as engines of growth. And interestingly, in the last decade or so, it's no longer just cities from the emblematic north, which are considered to be the engines of growth in the future, but amongst the engine cities now we get cited these familiar names of Shanghai and Sao Paulo, Bombay, Johannesburg, Cape Town, along with the likes of Toronto, Paris, London, New York and Frankfurt. And this publication, Cities of the Future, by PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, is a really, really typical example of this kind of projection of the future from within the city. This is a coming together of the consultancy with the mayors of most of these cities that I mentioned, okay, these kind of thrusting cities. And it's a projection, it's a publication that came out in 2008, and it emblematically summarizes our collective urban future. And it speaks of this publication of economies of proximity, resulting from the co-location of interrelated industries, producer services, and knowledge communities. And it talks about how cities offer opportunities for social networking, for association, and so on and so forth, and cultural and economic returns. It talks about the city's built environment and how certain attractive parts of the city feed into this, the territoriality of the knowledge economy. And what's interesting is when you step back from the PwC vision of future cities, it's an extraordinarily selective projection of the city. Only some parts of the city come into view. The central business districts, CBDs, the enterprise zones, the shopping malls, which is where the cool hang out, or maybe not, the transport and communications hubs, universities feature centrally in the PwC imaginary of the future, other centers of creativity, and of course gated communities, where the elites should live free from the contamination of the rest of the city. So the protagonists of this city, of business consultancy city, are also very selective. They are hardworking, qualified people on the move, building a life, having a lot of fun, but also working really hard. And the rest of the city, what Burdett and Sujitch call the rest of the cosmopolitan city, the endless city, the prosaic, the jobbing, the informal, the making do, the unkempt, the dirty city, kind of disappears out of view in business consultancy city. And what that means, I think, in numerical terms, particularly in the developing world, is the majority city disappears out of view. The size of the population of the elites who drive growth is actually really small. It's minute. The majority city in this imaginary is sensed to be of either no use to the business city or of jobbing use. The provision of usually low quality skills for business consultancy city, for the knowledge economy. And so because of that, because the majority city can be seen to be separate, not of our city, but sometimes, like a spider's thread, may be connected to our business needs, it's therefore treated conveniently as of another world. Okay? The rest of the city, as the elites from Shanghai make contact with the elites of New York. And I think paradoxically, and maybe because of the evacuation of elites from urban society broadly defined, my claim, and it's a controversial claim, and it's made me many more enemies than friends, is that the optic of those who find themselves on the side of the poor has also become telescopic. Whether it is out of choice, or out of resignation, or just pragmatic urgency, the need to do something for the neglected poor, in this second imaginary, what I call the human potential city, that part, the majority city, is referred to only to itself. It's referred only to interventions that will enhance self-help and, if you like, development from below. Now, what's interesting is that it's within human potential city, amongst those who kind of take care or want to take care of the poor, it's not always been like this. And if you think about only a decade ago, the iconic publication of UN Habitat came out, Slums of the World. Okay? It was the first and one of the most influential attempts to calculate the size of the world's slum population. And Slums of the World portrayed a very grim picture of the reality of slums. That publication said that in 2013, 2030, 50% of the urban population would exist on or under the poverty line, $1 a day at that time, living in slum conditions largely in cities of the South. It also showed that compared to such a population, only 6% of the developed world's population living in urban slums. In the developed world, it said the average figure for the developing world at that time was 43%. So that's almost half the population, okay, of cities in the developing world. And the verdict, the judgment made by UN Habitat was, this is just a bad thing. This is not a good thing. Okay? To live in a slum this was its own phrase. People live in slums and face a problem of multiple deprivation, from education to healthcare to everything else. Now, again, very interestingly, okay, look, this is textual analysis, but these happen to be quite iconic texts. These happen to be really important texts. A few years later, just less than a decade later, the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, celebrates its 20th anniversary, and it publishes the UN Human Development Report 2010. Even this report talks about the plight, the problem of over 1.75 billion people around the world suffering from multiple poverty. Okay, so it agrees on the statistics. But what's very interesting in the UNDP report, and it's a very important twist, based on the work of Amartya Sen, okay, what it says, it doesn't any longer define the right to human development for these 1.75 billion people as a bestowed right in the way that the UN Charter originally did in 46 or 47. But it says that we should think of the right to human development as one in which individuals and communities should be expected to acquire this right by enhancing their own capabilities. Okay? Sen's famous concept of capabilities. And that this should be done clearly not by the poor doing this themselves through bootstrap reforms, but that they should do this with the help of the pro-poor lobby, their advocates. Advocacy and material support from a variety of people who come together in the pro-poor policy community, local and international NGOs, sympathetic political organizations, and of course a bucket load of grassroots initiatives. And sort of what's happening here, I think, is that the volume of writing which begins to reinterpret the slum or the squatter city as a space of becoming from below is now beginning to grow quite fast. Okay, and this subtle turn includes quite a lot of page-turning ethnographies, usually by journalists, or even some serious literary figures. And these books, the latest one is by Catherine Boo of this slum outside Bombay, which actually is a great book. Okay, it doesn't glorify and romanticize poverty one bit. But in the process towards there have been more than a handful of books, which talk about slums as spaces of becoming. And two of these are a book by Robert Neuwirth called Shadow City, which came out in 2005, and another one by Doug Saunders called Arrival City. Okay, so these are serious New York-based journalists who absolutely care for the developing world, and then travel around the world and spend from a few days to a few months in different squatter settlements. Neuwirth effectively says, I mean, he looked at something like 20 squatter settlements around the world, and he says, one of the best things that's going on in these settlements, when you find good things, is self-help, is entrepreneurship, is people just getting on with things. And that if somehow local municipal authorities or governments were able to provide people with at least occupancy rights, not the rights of private property, but a right to occupancy, to occupy through rent possibly, the land that you're on. If people were given certain guarantees, including some minimum infrastructure, then Arrival, then I beg your pardon, then Shadow City, okay? Squatter City, can come to the foreground. It will no longer live in the shadows of illegality and informality if these communities are given certain rights, so that they can emerge, because the hunger and the willingness to emerge is absolutely there. And Saunders, Neuwirth is more sober than Saunders. Saunders is just Arrival City. He basically says that, again, he lists a countless number of settlements, he says, which sprout every day on the urban outskirts, where rural migrants driven to the city for work or for survival find in these grimy, ill-serviced clearances, because that's all they are, clearances on the edge of the city. He says, I found a teeming populace with the rural skills from back home and the drive to get on and up. That these are people who daily endure adversity, they mobilize entrepreneurship, they work with others to form businesses, they find work, they make savings, they make better homes. And he calls these arrival spaces, he calls them transition spaces. Okay? And it's a really interesting choice of words. He says they're transition spaces because these are spaces of mobility. They're a stopping point between the deprived and the depressed countryside and the glitz and shine of the city. That in these arrival spaces, these hyper poor but hyper energetic people eventually, he says, with the hand of the helping hand of the free market, and he says also strong and assertive government to spend heavily in this transition, they can become future entrepreneurs. Okay? So Saunders' view, I mean, it's an amazing view, that if the world is facing a problem of the unborn 3 billion, let's not worry too much about the 3 billion, because a very large section of these 3 billion people will become entrepreneurs of the future. Okay? They will become workers who can more or less do their own thing. So we have this very peculiar projection of different parts of the city, almost in identical language. What I've called in the paper Schumpeter Mark I and Schumpeter Mark II. Schumpeter, who wrote about when capitalism renews itself, certain forms of creativity are born. And so here we have two forms of creativity here. The creativity of elite city and the creativity of squatter city. Both of them finding their place in the sun in the future because of creativity, because of entrepreneurship. And so my argument is that telescopic urbanism, however you define it, whichever side you look at it, leaves out everything else, effectively. It leaves out the connections between City Mark I and City Mark II. But it does a lot more than that. It naturalizes what I would call the quarterized city, okay? The city split down the middle, or in different segments, left kind of apart, pretending that the urban excursions of the rich and the powerful, in order to secure a place for their part of the city in a world league. And on the other hand, the poor, now redefined as frontier survivalists and future middle classes, have no bearing on each other. Okay? They're both spaces of potential, disconnected with each other, and they will both be okay. So if our future urban age is to be a completely urban age, according to these two very powerful perspectives, if you just get a few things right, things will be more or less okay. So in this kind of optic, what we see then is a third perspective, surviving somewhere in the middle of these two, trying to make room for itself. Okay? And it's what I would call I call in this paper concessionary urbanism, okay? The concessionary city. And I'll try and explain what I mean by this. It goes something along these lines, that if the authorizing city neglects the poor, and if survivalist city kind of works on a hit and miss basis, then sometimes the authorities, whoever's in command and control of the city, whether it's the municipal authorities or private elites, will intervene on behalf of those residents in the city who are considered to be without rights. Okay? And this is a play on Partha Chatterjee's wonderfully famous work on what he calls political society, working from an Indian framework. And his argument is that in places like India, when the poor migrate to cities in very large numbers, these are the poor who are, he said, they're not part of what he would call civil society. They're not recognized as citizens, as poor people in the cities. But what they sometimes might be recognized as parts of political society. This is following the work of Antonio Gramsci. We don't need to go into Gramsci. The main point he makes is that as they are part of political society, if they win anything from the authorities, like access to water or to electricity or to housing rights, he says this happens in places like India, in political society, through struggles and organization on the part of the poor in order to then get some concessionary rights from the authorities. Whether the term concessionary urbanism is appropriate or political society is more appropriate, whether these best describe small acts of slum recognition in particular parts of the world. What I think is very clear from the kind of work that Partha Chatterjee has been doing and people who follow his work, primarily in a South Asian context, is that the gains that are made by the poor in places like Bombay or Delhi, in actual fact, are not the products of heroic individualism or a kind of free community spirit. But it seems that in these contexts, in the struggles of so-called political society, which is a battle between the haves and the have-nots mediated by the local state, getting access to the basics of life is actually the product of long and arduous collective struggle. It's not quite just the product of a kind of get-up-and-go entrepreneurialism on the part of the poor. Okay. And it is that, because it is aided by willing experts, activists, and organizations. In other words, what people like Chatterjee say is that, where the rights of the poor are recognized, not as civil rights, not as citizenship rights, okay, but as kind of concessionary rights, even this is the fruit of organization and a degree of common effort by the poor or on behalf of the poor against all the odds. Where in this organization you see learning going on, pooling, campaigning, and people, in a sense, learning to become political in order to then get certain concessionary rights. The communal tap, the communal toilet, electricity, better transport, connectivity. So the point that this kind of thinking makes here, in between survivalist city and elite city, is that where some things happen on the ground concerning the urban poor, where people get on the first rung of hope, it's actually the product of waiting for ages, of organizing, of doing something, of beginning to develop a kind of collective voice. And what Arjuna Padura has described as these are experiments of democracy deepened, okay, through a combination of alliances between the poor and their representatives. It's a political outcome. It's not a survivalist outcome. So this is the third optic that begins to disturb, let's call it, the strength of the first two imaginaries of the city. But a very key question is raised, at least a key question was raised for me, which is whether these the gains of political society, as I've very briefly described them, delivers satisfactory improvements in the lives of slum dwellers. And the claim that I make in this paper, that has my paper been circulated? Okay, so this is the paper that I've written called Telescopic Urbanism, which is going to come out in the journal City. There are 6 responses to it. I am quoted in every respect. And I'm given a very tough time, especially by Robert Neuwirth. So look out for this special issue when it comes out. And Anya Roy says, well, I'm onto something, but I'm wrong. So I'm obviously getting it all wrong in this paper. So what the claim that I make in this paper is that the gains that are acquired through political society, okay, I'm completely discounting survivalist society, gains that don't yield significant accumulations. Okay. So, for example, through political society, the public toilet that's acquired by by people living in squats, or the water pipe that arrives, normally takes about 10 to 20 years before it gets to a particular slum, and not even the one next door. And it's there, as I've already said, only because of an immense degree of organization and struggle, and really struggle against the odds, because daily life in a slum is not one in which people have got the time, the inclination, the skills to organize, to get themselves together in order to get these smallest concessions like a water tap. So insurgent urbanism or concessionary urbanism, depending on your point of view, I argue, involves a degree of effort and skill and commitment that the poor barely possess in order ultimately to secure fairly sporadic, fairly piecemeal, fairly rudimentary rights and services. And most importantly, although this is not Parther's argument, a kind of ironic consequence of the emphasis on political society, where you get rights only through organization and struggle, is that it speaks no truth to power at all. The powerful, in a sense, are moved to act in political society only under moral or political pressure. The rights of the poor are not recognized as basic human rights. And so that brings me to the final part of my talk. How am I doing for time, Hilda? Yeah, okay, good. So, now it may well be the case that slum dwellers who are completely left out of the calculus of civil society, maybe they can expect no more than this, okay? Maybe in the kind of the world that we live in of complete and total political neglect of the poor, maybe the only way forward is a few concessions here and then the poor just having to organize for themselves. But I think to stop here would be to concede more or less that any improvement in the conditions of the urban poor, to repeat, up to half of humanity by the middle of this century, essentially will remain only fragile, kind of hit and miss, and very easily undone when backs are turned. It is, I think, to concede that slum dwellers, because of their legal status, people without rights as such, remain a population without rights. And what I try and argue in this paper is that it is a delusion, an absolute delusion, to think that human potential city of bootstrap reforms from below can do without an explicit politics of what I call in the paper a politics of the staples, not necessarily a politics of individual human rights. And that's what I want to kind of end on in the next 15 minutes. And I talk about the necessity of, in a sense, pinning the discourse of human rights around infrastructure, okay? If you like, critical infrastructures which could be and should be offered to poor communities as a basic right. I'm talking about wires and wheels and sewers and building materials, occupancy rights to a degree, and all those things that in the makeshift city, once they are provided as basic rights, from primary education to primary health care, but above all, a right to occupancy, and there I agree with Robert Neuwirth, but also a degree of access to water and electricity, clean water and electricity, become really the territory of debate and discussion, I think. Okay? So a first step, possibly, towards the politics of the staples might well be to turn the telescope around so that the whole city comes back into view in the way that it's not happened in the last 20 to 30 years. And it's very interesting that, in fact, this is exactly what's happened with UN Habitat. Okay? So 2003, UN Habitat said, slum city is a problem city, something needs to be done. 8 years later, UNDP says, yes, there's a problem, but problem can be resolved from growth from below. And UN Habitat in 2010, 2011 produces another very important, very interesting report called the World Cities Report. This came out just 2 years ago. And in this report, UN Habitat, located in Nairobi, says that lifting people out of absolute urban poverty, and it says absolute urban poverty, not relative urban poverty, requires a rights-based regime of recognition and provision. It has an unambiguous subtitle. Okay? The main title is State of the World's Report, State of the World's Cities, and the subtitle is called Bridging the Urban Divide. It's one of the first time that the UN itself, Habitat itself, says actually the problem here is one part of the city not recognizing the other part of the city and not doing anything about it. And the report says it appeals to policymakers and practitioners to make a commitment to the poor, A, on a human rights basis, B, to do so through schemes that improve access to serviced housing, education, and economic participation. And thirdly, and rather grandiosely, it says, and the poor should also be, following Henri Lefebvre, that they should also be given the right of the opportunity to participate in a city's politics. Now you could argue, we, if we're slightly cynically minded, might say, well, this is a kind of impossibly utopian sense that UN Habitat has of the city of the future. But I sympathize with the UN Habitat publication, because my feeling is that without this kind of a move, the adventurism of business consultancy city will find no limit whatsoever. And any idea of inclusion of the poor within the life of the city categorically then, or rather by definition, remains just something restricted to the labors of people, the poor themselves. And I kind of tend to agree that it's only this kind of universalism of the language of universal human rights, whether they're infrastructure or individually located, begins to nudge us out of this comfort zone or demonic zone of thinking that nothing can be done, if you like, by the public authorities for the poor. So the question then that is posed is, well, what's the nature of the minima of a rights-based approach to urban inclusion? Okay, what Colin McFarlane, who's been doing some fantastic work on slums in the last few years, he calls the obligatory points of passage. Okay, what are the obligatory points of passage for a rights-based perspective on the city? Of course, above all, this would depend on the particularities of place that define the possible. Places vary absolutely in terms of their constitutional and their fiscal specificities. And these determine who has rights. It also determines what can be afforded by the municipal authorities. One of the classic problems in the cities of the developing world is that even when you have a willing state, that willing state is unable to fund, because of the appalling fiscal tax revenue that it has, what's required by the poor. So, of course, location has an incredibly important role to play here in terms of what can be done. But with bearing in mind these sorts of differences, I just pose this as a question. Might it not be possible, okay, at least to deduce a minimum set of rights of the poor, okay, rather than a maximum set of rights of the poor? And could it not be, following the amazing research, particularly of an ethnographic nature that you find in different slums and cities of the world, which consistently say the prime problem in squatter city, in slum city, is a problem of infrastructure. That is absolutely the prime problem. That the difference that is made by access to clean water and sanitation and healthcare and so on and so forth, what we take completely for granted in the developed world, makes the difference between the possibility of surviving and leading a slightly better life and spending all of your life, quite simply, trying to acquire water that you walk to for miles and miles, and then you get it's dirty water, it's unclean water. Or indeed with electricity, and all these things come together as a kind of bundle of infrastructural rights. So here then we have to go back into a language of what might these basic infrastructural rights be? Could access to housing be one of these infrastructural rights where the housing doesn't need to be provided on a private basis, but is provided as a public good, underwritten through public ownership or through the state? I said time and again the water talks about infrastructures, concrete material infrastructures as obligatory points of passage. So if housing and basic infrastructure became defined as a space of absolute right of access by the poor as well in a city, then it seems to me that we begin to open, at least conceptually, if not politically, a way into seeing the city as a whole. Seeing the infrastructure that snakes through the city, in all parts of a city, as a unified infrastructure, providing basic education or primary health care or water or sanitation and the disposal of sewage. And I don't have the time to go into this, but it does seem to be the case in some parts of the world, and here the Latin Americans' experience of the Latin American squatter cities is absolutely emblematic, that where human rights become defined as, let's call them territorial or infrastructural rights, shared by everybody in the city, then it seems at that point what happens is that the poor are also then prepared to pay affordable tariffs for the services which are provided. So, none of this discussion is about providing free access to infrastructural rights to the poor who live in slums. The argument is about public subvention of certain basic hard, if you like, the hard infrastructure of provision, so that the soft access, whether it's IT or water or software, essentially becomes something that the poor can legitimately help in constructing, but also in paying for it. And here the discussion has moved miles away from a discussion a few years ago in which people said, if you provide basic services to the poor, it has to be on a free basis. Okay? There's a bucket load of research that itself shows the poor are willing to pay. The poor don't object to paying. What the poor really want is right of access. That's the key thing here. So, just to come to a kind of long conclusion, what I think I'm trying to argue here is that unless we begin to open up this discussion of questions of universal access in city X or Y, questions of access to infrastructure that somebody has to provide for, and it could be a coalition of international investors, municipal authorities, immense pressure on national governments from donors that unless you actually provide basic infrastructure in the poor areas, you get no aid money. There are all sorts of things that can be done here to bring back the city in full view. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because at the moment, And perhaps where I started off was wrong. Okay? In the beginning, I described the city of the future as two separate parts. That remains the case. But at the same time, there's something else going on. Business consultancy city, elite city, is also on the march. It's absolutely on the march. So all the cities that I mentioned, whether it's Cape Town, or Johannesburg, or Nairobi, or Bombay, or Jakarta, or Rio, these are cities, because of the sorts of things that PricewaterhouseCoopers says, these are cities which are aspiring to become global cities. Okay? The metaphor that is used for these cities is they're aspiring to become world-class cities. And part of the rhetoric of becoming a world-class city, at a time in which the surplus population is no longer required by the elites to service their own needs, or only a tiny proportion is required. The rest can be just left to one bit and is a blot on the landscape. In world-class city, what we see today, as real estate values rise, as the size of the elite begins to increase, these gigantic slum clearance programs, which are led by the elites and the middle classes, working with international investors and with these kind of semi-corrupt or inefficient local authorities, essentially to clear the slums, to push the poor out of the city, to displace them, to put them out of sight somewhere else on the edge. This is exactly what's going on in Bombay. This is exactly what's going on in Delhi and a countless number of cities which are aspiring for world-class status. Okay? So it's not as though the elites are occupying just a certain part of the city of the future. They want all of the middle of the city. They want all of the parts of the city in which at the moment people are in temporary shelter, which becomes a permanent form of shelter. To the degree that in places like Delhi, what we have is new laws are being passed. Okay? The legal structure is being changed in order to clear the poor. There was an unbelievable development at the time of the Commonwealth Games 2 or 3 years ago. Up until then, in a place like India, where the poor really did have some strong, if not legal rights, the rights of the concessionary state, you just couldn't shift people out that easily. In the run-up to the Commonwealth Games, the courts were given the power to move people out of their slums on aesthetic grounds. For the first time ever in Indian history, if the courts were presented with a case that said that a slum here is unpleasant aesthetically because it smells, because it gets in the way, because it's a blot on the landscape of Delhi, it can be moved. So, just to conclude, what I'm trying to argue here is that an urban future is going to be an urban future in which we will have an extraordinarily high number of people living and facing multiple deprivation. In that city, the most prestigious, the most valued parts of the real estate will continue to be colonized by the middle class elites. In that kind of scenario, where the surplus population in old Marxian terms really is no more than a lumpen proletariat, it's no longer even a surplus population that's required for work from time to time. The problem of squatter city and the problem of living increasingly on the geographical edge of the city, because the poor have been pushed out of the city by the middle classes, creates an unbelievably immense problem. And I can't find a way around this problem without some kind of return to a discourse of rights. I can't find a way around this problem without going back to the question of what are the shared commons for and who are they for. We may move away we may agree that actually a discourse of human rights centered around the deserving individual is problematic. I mean, I don't think it is problematic, but many people think it is problematic. But I don't think we can move away from the notion that some of the actual basics of life which make us human can be taken away. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ash, for this really interesting presentation. My wish is to now put just a couple of questions. They're rather big, but keep it short. Okay. Just to open some discussion, and then I'll give you a few minutes to just think aloud around these issues, and then we open up for the rest of the audience. And I'd like to bring up two different kinds of divides that I and probably others in this room are sometimes grappling with. And we're talking about academic divides in our ways of seeing things. And the first one would be this really sharp divide that we see within urban studies between research carried on cities in the so-called global south and on cities in the global north. And this is problematic because it sort of paralyzes us from drawing on insights and theorizing from both ends, but also because this divide is really skewed. Because theory, when it travels in one direction. It travels north to south and not the other way. So I just wanted to pick your brains a little bit on this. If you have thought about this, you yourself are straddling this divide quite evidently now. This is something that I feel that some of us would need to think a lot deeper about. How can we move towards a more comparative international urban studies of the kind that is not universalizing and of the kind that is not giving an hegemonic or a dominant position to Western urban theory? You getting my point?
Okay.
Yeah, the second divide is about the literature on social movements and political organizing connection to cities. Because on the one hand, you have, for instance, these really, there's lots of work being written now on the Occupy movements and the new social movements in Europe and North America. We had recently Eric Swingedal coming and talking to us about those issues. On the other hand, you have all these very diverse kinds of organizations of poor people in cities of the global south. So very recently we had someone else that you might recognize, David Satterthwaite, coming and talking about the federations of the urban poor. And these debates, these literatures just don't speak to each other. So there's a lot of work to be done to start connecting these things together on some level. So how can we learn across? How can they cross-fertilize each other?
Okay.
So just a few minutes.
That's great, thanks. Okay, I'll try and keep it quite brief. So a while ago, and it's been going on for quite a while now, after Jenny Robinson published her book called The Ordinary City, there's been an attempt to argue that we need to look at the world, or the cities of the world, from a southern perspective. And I disagree with that view for one simple reason. I think all cities of the world now need to be seen from a singular perspective. Because in an age of globalization and the perforation of the boundaries of the city, to different degrees, all cities effectively, I think, in a sense, have been drawn into the same kind of world logic of development or underdevelopment. All cities are more or less exposed to market forces. All cities are more or less telescopic. All cities are more or less environmentally damaged. And all cities are actually connected to each other. In an urbanizing world, the flows of capital, the relations of power are intercity. There's a fantastic new book by Peter Taylor just on that. So what I think we need to do is to take very seriously Doreen Massey's assertion that the modern urban condition is a condition of territorial thrown togetherness, okay, where you get all sorts of very different, incompatible diversities kind of coexisting without any form of cohesion between them in particular territorial forms. And there could be, there could be cities by the seaside, there could be cities in the north, there could be cities in the south. And that these entities of thrown togetherness are constantly being pulled apart because of their extra geographical connections too. These developments are not just developments that northern cities face. These are developments that all cities of the world face as well. And so, so what's required, I think, and I'm kind of really sticking my neck out here, is a unitary theory of the city, okay, of what the city is as a territorial form, so that then we can do proper, validated comparative research, using similar conceptual frameworks in order to then understand why is the world as differentiated as it is. How does thrown togetherness play out very differently from Cape Town than, let us say, in London? But the first thing we have to do is we have to recognize that they face a common, if not identical, ontology. That's the kind of the key thing there. And so these would be steps towards a comparative urbanism in which particular assumptions about the cityness of cities are held in common. These are that we can agree over. And your second point, that's a really great point. It's the connection between the kind of Swingedouw city and a Satterthwaite city are absolutely needed. And I think they're needed in this sense, and I think we could probably, I can answer your question through Swingedouw Mark I and Swingedouw Mark II. Okay? So Swingedouw Mark I, Erik Swingedouw writes some 10 years ago, he writes about the city as a metabolic entity, okay? A city in which, particularly around the politics of water, we should think of cities as live and lively entities in which the kind of enhancements or the diminishing of prospects, territorial and social, are determined by these metabolic flows. Swingedouw too, partly because of what's been going on in the world in the last couple of years or so, in a sense, is the Swingedouw protest movements. And I think what David Satterthwaite does in his work on slums is effectively he connects up the two. Okay? That can we begin to think of the squat settlements that he works on as metabolic entities, which is effectively what I was trying to argue as well. And if we start thinking of these places as metabolic entities, then what could a politics of occupation deliver or fail to deliver? So now I really will answer your question. If a politics of metabolism in the city, a politics of water, or electricity, or whatever else that, in a sense, flows through the city, if that politics is reduced to the precarities of street-level organization or not, then I think we're in trouble. So the politics of the metabolic city requires, I think, a form of the bureaucratization of the gains that need to be made constant, or the returns that need to be made constant, such as ensuring that day in, day out, water is delivered, or ensuring day in, day out that markets can work in a particular way. So do you see what I'm getting at? That I think the inevitable seductions of things like the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, I think viewed from the perspective of the slum, can only be one stage in the process of organization. The rest has to do with the bureaucratization of the gains that are absolutely necessary and that need to be fixed. And that's the politics of metabolism, not a politics of agitation. I think.
Mm. Any other questions or reflections that you want to add before we close? Otherwise, we're very grateful for this opportunity to try to start thinking how to cross different kinds of divides and one-sided views of the city. So thank you very much.
Thank you.